And joining me now is Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation in America. Dhruva, good to see you. Thanks for your time here on NDTV. Interesting times with the trade deal now being announced. We still don't have the full picture and details are awaited. I hear we'll get more of that in a day or two. But my first question to you, Dhruva, is did this deal happen in your view, because India and the Prime Minister stayed calm through the turbulence, with President Trump? Or do you think it was because Trump ultimately needed India more than he admitted? Which one was it, straight off?
Look, I can't read President Trump's mind. I don't think many people can, even his close advisors. But I think we know a few things that happened. India had been asking for a deal, sort of a trade agreement, sort of offered one quite soon after his inauguration last year. And negotiations actually began in earnest. And so, if we rewound this to April of last year, we would have said that India would have been one of the first countries to get a comprehensive agreement. Then, of course, we had a sort of downturn in relations after Operation Sindoor. We had 9 months or so of a sort of frosty relationship. And now something has changed. I suspect, again, we can only speculate, that two factors at least played a role. One was India was showing that it was still open for business and conducting business as usual. It concluded trade agreements with the UK and with the European Union and New Zealand, and amongst others. And secondly, I think the idea that sort of it was not having an effect. We actually saw Indian exports to the US increase by about 26% last quarter over the year before. And US exports only grew 3%. So I think a combination that it was not really working and that obviously a lot of other things were being held back in the relationship because of differences over trade.
There was a sense, Dhruva, that this was going to take some time, maybe a few more months. For most people watching, it seemed to come out of nowhere when the president, dropped that comment on his social media. Was there a tipping point in your view? Something specific, or was it a slow build-up and then it just happened? Or was there a more immediate sort of catalyst that created this breakthrough?
Again, we can only speculate. In hindsight, I think, we'll find out more in the next few months and years about, what actually perhaps happened and what motivated Trump to make the change, because it really was dependent on him. I mean, many other people, even in December, the US Trade Representative said that in a Senate hearing that India was offering the best deal ever. And so even people, the senior officials in the US had accepted the fact that this was on the table for some time. And in July last year, actually, there was a very, the two sides came very close to an announcement. The Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, today has clarified some of these issues. So I think, we don't know what was the tipping point, but I think a certain confluence of factors came together. One is, I think, again, enough time had elapsed. Two, Russian oil imports from India had come down, and India could say that has taken place. Three, we had personnel in place. You had a US ambassador in place. You have an assistant secretary at the State Department. So I think all of those factors help. But ultimately, what pushed things over the edge is anyone's guess.
On the issue of Russian oil specifically, there continues to be a lack of, complete clarity. President Trump was very specific, of course, and we've heard from White House officials as well. On the Indian side, nothing specific just yet, except that, market prices and market forces will dictate how India purchases its oil. There was also a comment about how, India is committed to purchasing energy from non-sanctioned entities. How do you see that working out? Because that became one of the major sticking points in this entire process, Dhruva.
Yeah, but look, it's hard to say. I think the problem with oil and other commodities is that they actually function on a global in a global marketplace. And when there is a global shortage, India has to source oil from where it can, and that really has been the case the last few years. One of the factors I think that is changing is that there's a lot more oil coming online, particularly actually the Western Hemisphere. So from the US, Canada, Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela now possibly, and that is going to help sort of stabilize oil prices. Again, this could be thrown for a six by a lot of things, including what happens potentially in Iran and in the Gulf in the next few years. So I think, it's very hard to say because you have market forces at play.
One of the angles, Dhruva, that's been, written about extensively over the last few months is that, India has been pushing back on very key issues like agro and dairy and energy, like we just pointed out. Is that something that you think, in some ways did have an impact in these negotiations. India was a country that definitely drew a line and said, we are here to negotiate, but there are some things that we simply won't concede on.
No, I think absolutely. And again, Minister Piyush Goyal's statement today, again, clarified that a little bit. And again, we saw similar dynamic at play in the EU trade negotiations, which I think, frankly, many of us thought would be more difficult. But look, every country has its red lines when it comes to trade negotiations. It's politically sensitive sectors. And I think trade negotiators have to keep that in mind and then reach compromise in other areas where they're able to make that compromise. But I think, again, the more trade, one of the, I think, the lessons is that the more trade deals you have, the more leverage you have with others, right? If you had EU, from Europe, wines and whiskeys coming in, this would really be to the long-term disadvantage of, for example, US exporters in those sectors. So I think, again, these external factors sometimes help clarify where negotiators can make certain trade-offs. But look, overall, I think all trade negotiations are difficult, and everyone understands that they have red lines. There's a famous, most trade negotiators know there's the Japanese rice farmers who are completely sacrosanct. They cannot be touched because they're politically so powerful, and every country has its equivalent of that.
In your view, zooming out just a little bit, Dhruva, does this mark, some kind of a shift for India from an earlier kind of dynamic which was, independent, non-alignment, to a more sort of unapologetic recognition that transactional geopolitics, is very much a reality?
I don't think that has changed in my view. Look, India has always been quite autonomous from independence and remains so. And I don't think that will change anytime. It's a large country with its own identity. I think the difference is, does your autonomy mean that you say no to opportunities that might be beneficial, or do you say yes to opportunities? And I think what you've seen, again, we've gone from an idea of 10 years between 2014 and a little after that, where India did not conclude any trade agreements, to suddenly concluding 8 trade agreements since 2021, right? Yeah. So I think it is let's seize the opportunities that present themselves, because they actually make you stronger.
Speaking about, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, two popular leaders, two leaders who've had, who have enjoyed big followings in their countries. What does this breakthrough, Dhruva, tell us about, their sort of relationship, their chemistry? Did that play a part in it? Because like you said, it's been a bit of a roller coaster arriving till this point. There have been conversations. There's been this periodic expression of warmth and affection. And we both know that does play a part. But we did see some ups and downs.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think particularly on the US side, I don't think we've had a situation where personalities matter to this extent. Obviously, the personality of the US president matters and the worldview of the US president. But I think to the same extent that it is really a signal to the larger system, to the bureaucracy, to the political leadership in his own country. So, again, the biggest significance of the announcement on Monday was Trump signaling on Truth Social that it is okay to do business with India. That is really, and now the details are being hashed out. I think we'll have the technical details. We'll wait for executive orders and joint statement, I think, soon, which will offer a technical roadmap for implementation. But that, I think that personality does matter more than even more than in the past. And therefore, not just Prime Minister Modi, but many other countries have struggled with this issue, which is how do you engage with Trump personally? I mean, just to give a very different example, this week, the Colombian president was in town and they'd had a bit of a war on words on social media, but then they met in person and it seemed to be a much warmer and more constructive meeting. And so those personal engagements do matter. I think this did require a call from the Prime Minister. Nobody else could have gotten things over the line. It had to be the leader of the country. Obviously, I think in this day and age, it matters more than perhaps in the past.
Dhruva, you've had a ringside view of what's happening in Washington. And I completely agree with you. Nobody can really read what's happening on the US president's mind. But, post-Sindoor, when things sort of became frosty, how was it processing all of that? Much of it was unexpected. One expected a certain degree of alignment with India. We saw what happened with Pakistan. What was it like looking at all of that happen up close?
I think, from Trump's second inauguration, to May 10th, end of Operation Sindoor, I think it had been apparent to many of us. In fact, I wrote something just a few days before Operation Sindoor by coincidence, which was that this idea of Trump being obsessed with or very concerned about his legacy and this idea of him as a peacemaker was taking priority over a lot of other engagements, including with China. So, the US was in some ways downplaying some of the balance of power logic that was driving the US-India relationship because of Trump's idea that he wanted to settle disputes between the US, Europe, and Russia, in Gaza, in between the US and China even. And we're still seeing elements of that at play. So I think, we saw that coming. I think the extent of it has surprised a lot of people. And it's not just with India, even with, the sort of remarkable message that Trump sent to the Prime Minister of Norway about the Nobel Peace Prize and how that influenced his engagement with Europe. So again, I think some of that was coming. I think the extent of it was quite surprising. And yet again, over the last few months, you did see a defense framework agreement signed between the two countries. You had a major gas deal signed at the end of the year. You've had AI investments from US entities into India despite the tariffs. And so a lot of the normalcy kind of continued under the political level. But at the same time, we didn't have any cabinet level engagement, at least from the US to India, since March of last year, I believe. So again, I think again, on the one hand, it has been a very strange period because it has been so individualized, again, more than in the past. And yet again, that sort of normal structural engagement had continued in many ways.
Final question, Dhruva. If Trump's unpredictability is something that everyone's got to live with. Many will be wondering how durable any India-US understanding on trade can actually be. What do you think?
Look, it's hard to say. Again, this so far it seems like this is a framework agreement that offers the broad contours of a sort of trade normalization between India and the US. Some of the details are still being hashed out. We will probably find out in the next few days what some of them are. But I would contrast it with what we've seen between India and the EU and India and the UK, which are quite binding, ratified agreements that have to pass the legislatures. These are much more detailed and locked in some ways, and would be much harder to undo as a result. To give two very different examples, Trump recently applied tariffs on the UK for its involvement in Greenland. After the UK, after the British leadership thought that some of that had been settled, and then more recently threatened 25% tariffs against South Korea, again after a trade deal had been. So again, I'd say watch the space. We're only a little over 1 year into a 4-year administration. A lot could change, but I think the more both sides see a value in investing in each other, and again, there are a lot of American companies that are chomping at the bit to invest in nuclear, in AI data centers, in manufacturing, and a whole bunch of. They've been waiting for some clarity, and they now have that clarity. So the more I think the stakeholders on both sides are invested in this, the harder it will be to relapse into something worse.
Dhruva Jaishankar, a pleasure to have you with me here on NDTV. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shiv.